My name is Jane Reese Coulbourne. I'm the Executive Director of the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA. And this morning I wanted to take you through looking at what the Research Resources Group is actually doing. As Deborah mentioned, there are three major pieces of the CPTR structure, and this particular one at this point is run by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So as we look at research resources, what are we really about? I mean, to a certain extent, I guess the way I look at it is we're obviously about supporting the larger CPTR, but I think we're also about ethics and empowerment. So we're a little bit different than some of the other groups. Part of our reason for being here is to ensure that this is an ethical process, and that there is access and appropriate use of drugs. But then also from a support standpoint, we're looking at trying to come up with additional resources, identify needs, create additional funding sources, and looking at global regulatory pathways. So the mission really is to make sure, just like the rest of CPTR, we want to make sure that CPTR is successful and that the TB drug development is successful, and so we're really about supporting that effort. And so our goal is to work collaboratively with all of the partners and identify and address challenges. So I suspect as time goes on, we will be continuing to develop and evolve. Since we are one of the support components of this project, we need to change and add and delete things as we go. But as we're looking at what we're really working on at this point in time, capacity building related to clinical trial sites, trying to make sure we have global participation in addressing some of these regulatory challenges, and then promoting engagement of all stakeholders involved in a TB trial, and that includes the patients and the community. And then fostering access to these new therapies and making sure that there is appropriate use. So if you look at our various working groups, access and appropriate use, we're trying to make sure that we take a look at not only pre-approval access, but post-approval access, and trying to figure out what the challenges are, and then in the end, shorten the regulatory and policy process to accelerate access to these drugs. And so, I'll talk more about that group in a second. The Clinical Trials Infrastructure Work Group is really about trying to build some clinical trial and laboratory site capacity and improve quality. The Global Regulatory Pathways Work Group is trying to identify and address the challenges that are in the current regulatory processes and find new and existing pathways to facilitate efficient review. And last but not least is stakeholder and community engagement, trying to identify and develop resources that are going to help us involve the community more in the clinical trial process and make sure that appropriate stakeholders are involved, and that ultimately the drug trial process is improved and it's a good experience for those participating in the trials. We have, at this point, written a paper on compassionate use and expanded access, and to a large extent that is really defining what those things mean. There's a variety of definitions for some of these terms, and they're viewed differently from different perspectives. So what we've done is kind of an overview paper that looks at compassionate use and expanded access, pre-approval access basically, and it's now awaiting publication in the International Journal of TB and Lung Diseases. So once we got through the process of defining that, the next steps are trying to figure out, how do we actually identify what these challenges are? Pre-approval access has its own challenges that we're trying to look at, and we will, as you see in the next steps, at some point be working with the WHO recommendations on appropriate use. So we're trying to look at this from a global perspective and identify what possibilities there are for pre-approval use, particularly in more advanced tuberculosis. Post-approval, of course, has a whole different array of challenges, and so we're going to be looking at what are the current situations in post-approval access. I mean, how do certain countries take up the drug once a drug has been approved in their country? How does that work? And what challenges can we hopefully mitigate before we get to that point? So again, this is all about providing appropriate access, but also trying to figure out ways to get people drugs quicker that need them. The clinical trial infrastructure is really trying to figure out how to build capacity from a clinical trial standpoint, which it can be quite challenging. So the group to date has provided a forum for a number of clinical trial networks, donors, researchers, and so we're trying to put together a collaboration at the end, and have done a collaboration at the TB Union meetings, and are working on an online database that links experienced sites with groups who are looking for capacity. So coming forward, they'll be developing agreed upon standards for assessing and ensuring quality. Let me take a screenshot from, just to give you a little example of the clinical trials database. This is the kind of data that they're gathering and pulling together a number of site-specific pieces of information so that as people are looking for additional clinical trial sites, they can go into this database and glean some information that might be useful. So global regulatory pathways, kind of to distinguish it from some of the other groups, is really trying to lay the groundwork for figuring out how we might do joint review for TB clinical trials and marketing authorizations, and trying to make the review process more efficient. So at this point, the group is basically working on presenting concepts for joint review and other regulatory pathways to a global audience looking for feedback. And so that I know Martha Brumfield from the Critical Path Institute is leading that effort, and they will be working with a number of global regulators to talk about, is it possible to really do a joint review, or at least to some extent a joint review, maybe even regional reviews, so that we can make the process a lot more efficient and not have to worry too much about multiple sets of criteria. And so as we think about joint review, they've kind of come up with some specific required elements that obviously will be very important, agreement being number one. And so she's looking at, or they're working on consensus from all countries involved in the joint review, and trying to get somebody designated from each country involved to participate in the process. And as they work on support, trying to play the role of kind of the neutral partner, facilitating the review and information dissemination, and again, looking at funding sources and agreement on the format of the submission. So as you can imagine, this is pretty challenging to look at all of these high-burden TB countries and try to work together with the other regulatory authorities and come up with some sort of joint review process. Stakeholder and community engagement, we have recently released the Good Participatory Practice Guidelines, the GPP as we call it. It's kind of, in our way of thinking, sort of like a GMP sort of document, where we're trying to create standards for organizations to look at how participants should be treated in the clinical trial process, what sorts of infrastructure really ought to be in place, and incorporating good practices into the TB drug research. And so we've created this document that really is an adaptation from an AVAC document working on HIV prevention trials. And so we've adapted it to TB drug trials. And so that document, we have a review of that and some more information if you're interested in looking at the details of that. We would be very interested in getting feedback if you have other ideas. The full document is online, but we do have a summary that you can look at and get a better idea of what goes into that. But what we're trying to do now is take that from a concept document where we talk about principles. Next steps will be related to developing tools and materials to help facilitate the implementation of this. So the first part is really principles and guidelines, and the next part will be real hands-on materials and tools. And ultimately, we're hoping to identify some clinical trial sites that we could pilot some of these practices in. The guidelines are really trying to make the trial participant the center of, or the focus of our attention at this point, and trying to involve various communities in the participation. And we think that ultimately will not only be better for the participants, but I think will actually strengthen the clinical trial process and allow for not only better accrual, but probably better retention. And so, again, shared standards, expectations, accountability, and really looking at outcomes, trying to make sure that communities are really engaged at every level to make sure that this is really appropriate for the area where the trial's being done and also for the trial participants. Thank you.